Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In our first segment, we're going to discuss the Brexit deal, which seemingly Prime Minister Johnson has reached with the European Union. But we've been here before, of course. Theresa May, too, his predecessor, did reach a deal with the European Union. And as we well know, the UK Parliament rejected that a number of times. So now Prime Minister Johnson's had his go at this. And of course, the tricky bit, especially for the DUP, the Northern Irish Party as well, is that border or backstop, as we know it, between Northern Ireland and Ireland itself. Can this all be worked out in this deal? Will this deal work? Jeremy Corbyn has already said it should be rejected, but will Johnson be able to convince the DUP to come on board? And if so, does this mean this deal will go through in Parliament? A lot of questions, of course, going forward. Let's now discuss this a bit further with our guests who are joining us to discuss this. We're joined by Alex de Ruyter, who's director of the Centre for Brexit Studies at Birmingham City University. He's joining us from Birmingham itself. And we're also joined by Benjamin Martill, who is a lecturer in politics at the University of Edinburgh. He's also co-editor of the volume Brexit and Beyond, Rethinking the Futures of Europe. He's joining us now from London. Benjamin and Alex, thank you for your time today. Benjamin, what are your thoughts about this deal? We've been here before, as I said. Will the DUP be convinced on this border?
Well, I think, yes, you're absolutely right. We have been here before. It's pretty clear that the EU didn't really offer anything to Johnson that they weren't prepared to give May. Don't forget the initiative came from Johnson's new proposals, which would introduce this separation between Northern Ireland and the UK, which the DUP have said that they would veto. I think the interesting question now becomes what is the power position of the DUP? Because they're obviously needed to back up the government and get any legislation through. At the same time, now that there's a lot of speculation that in the next few months an election will be imminent, it's very likely that the DUP will not be involved in future governing arrangements. So the DUP draw their power from the very specific issues coming out of the 2017 general election where Theresa May lost her majority. So that may well be in the back of some of their legislators' minds. But they could still cause a big headache for Johnson, not least because they could withdraw their 10 MPs' support, but also because the European Research Group of right-wing pro-Brexit conservatives are closely watching the DUP to see what they say about the deal.
All right, so Alex, what are your thoughts on this? Do you think that this will possibly go to Parliament? As I said, Corbyn has already said it shouldn't.
No, I don't. And I think just to add to that, of course, you have 21 Tory MPs who were expelled from their party. And, they include people like Philip Hammond and David Gauke, ex-Justice Secretary, and so on. And, of course, Dominic Grieve. And, if you take Dominic Grieve as an example, I think he won't support an agreement unless there's a commitment to another referendum. So you can't even take the votes of those 21 shall we say, independent Conservative MPs for granted either. And then you add to that people like Anna Soubry of the Change UK party as it was. Johnson is well short of a majority, and so he would be left relying on, in effect, I think maybe 20 or 30 Labour MPs to cross the floor and support these plans. And the other aspect of all this, of course, with seeking a more limited economic relationship with the European Union going forward, of course, is to allow the government to pursue regulatory divergence. That sounds fairly anodyne, but in layman's terms, that would mean pursuing different standards for environmental controls or food standards or a raft of other measures which would be designed to appeal more to, say, a trade deal with the United States. Now, for the Labor Party in particular, a lot of these things are going to be anathema because, to use their language, this will cut across the platform of rights that workers and consumers currently enjoy in the UK. And for that reason, I think Labor MPs would find it very difficult to support the thrust of this deal.
Okay, so then, Benjamin, this back to an issue which has been obviously long-standing, and again, about the backstop and the border between Ireland and Northern Ireland. I mean, that issue would still remain then, right? Outstanding. If this deal doesn't go through in Parliament, does anyone out there really have a better solution to this?
I mean, you're right. This is the fundamental problem because there's no way that you can push a square peg into a round hole, right? I mean, there's no way of allowing for there to be no border between in the island of Ireland and for having no divergence between the UK and Northern Ireland. And this is why various convoluted proposals have been suggested by May and now by Johnson. And of course, this is why we're in the political situation we're in, because not only the DUP, but also all of these other groupings have a veto over a deal that was never going to please anyone. I suppose the only thing that you can really take from that is that because there's no combination or no outcome that everyone would sign up to, it's almost like a game of poker. It makes much more sense to think about what the other person's cards are, and in a sense, it's less going to be the content of the deal, and it's more going to be what the threatened alternative is. So, of course, Labour don't like the deal. Of course, the DUP don't like the deal. But the interesting thing will be what the alternative is for them, and whether or not enough Labour MPs can be scared by the idea of a no-deal Brexit, which Johnson was, of course, flirting with. Now, his credibility in that regard, since the Benn Act, is quite limited, but I think still, the talk in the sort of political centre here is that it is much more likely now that we might see the government try to engineer a no-deal scenario than Theresa May's government would have done. So that's going to be part of their calculations.
Alex, what are your thoughts on that? Because again, this seems to have been the major issue, as I put to Benjamin as well. Does anyone have a better solution? Does Labour? Does DUP? Does anybody really know what can be done when it comes to the border between Ireland and Northern Ireland?
Yeah, it's a good point. It's easy for Parliament to say what it opposes because it's just a bunch of disparate MPs with very different views on the relationship with Europe. Of course, in terms of what Parliament is for, well, you really need to come back to the manifestos and the positions of the political parties. Now, if Labor voted that deal down, what would they be voting for? They've always stated they want an election. They've stated they want to get no deal removed from the table. So therefore, in terms of the Benn-Burt Act, Johnson would be obliged after the 19th of October to go and seek an extension from Brussels, which I think for no other reason than technical ones in the improbable event of an agreement being reached would still happen anyway. That assumedly would buy them time to try and engineer an election or possibly even another referendum. They would be the alternatives. I think it's fair to say that there does not appear to be a parliamentary solution to this gridlock. That is certainly the case, I think. But, that's why we're then talking into the territory of a general election as such, which Johnson wants clearly, or and the Labour Party appear to want, or another referendum, for example.
I wonder then, Benjamin, if there were a referendum, if there were elections, do you think that Britons would now move away from actually wanting to exit the EU? I mean, I wonder really what the public sentiment is like, because from what I've understood, you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that there is still support for Brexit itself.
Public sentiment is still almost as divided as it was in 2016. There's been very few shifts, but of course now the picture has got much more complex because the various permutations of future relationship with the EU fit very poorly into the categories of being a member and not being a member. That really is all about whether you're in the political institutions, and as we've seen with all the different models, there's a lot of other forms of association. So public opinion is much more complex on this issue. I don't know what would happen in the second referendum. I think it would be a fairly bad idea if it was just a repeat of the 2016 vote without having implemented the mandate from the 2016 vote. And I say that as a Remainer. I think we have democratic and representational problems if that happens. But I do think, and this probably wouldn't fit with the political situation at the moment, but if you ask me my personal opinion, I'd say that there should be a vote on any deal that's reached, because it will need to be legitimated. And of course, the problem is that whatever is agreed now, if it goes through Parliament, will still scrape by as a Conservative Brexit and won't be accepted by broad sections of the population. And I think that really the problem since Theresa May's government actually has been that we haven't been able to have a conversation about how we can go around getting broad-based support for a particular outcome for Brexit.
Indeed, and that seems to have been the main issue, as I brought up with you numbers in previous shows, Alex, the polarization that this has caused, right, within UK society. Would, as you had put it as well, a referendum and or elections, would either of that bridge that divide in any way?
I'm not convinced a general election would bridge that divide. No, I think the Conservatives, for example, have been polling, in terms of YouGov and these predictors, roughly about 1/3 of the vote share, which is no guarantee that they could affect a majority should they go down that path and get that opportunity. I mean, there has to be a way to draw a line under this, otherwise we risk this going on for years. Of course, just the very process of trying to renegotiate a new economic relationship with Europe could easily take 10 years, not the year and a half that Johnson seems to want to promise his followers. So a referendum and nothing else, it's binary in the sense of yes or no. Will it guarantee a decisive outcome? No. So I think, the unfortunate reality is that the Brexit genie has been let out of a bottle, and the divisions that this has created will not be resolved easily or anytime soon,
Very well. We'll leave that as a final word, but of course we appreciate both Alex and Benjamin for their time, of course, for their expert insight and putting this all into context for us. Certainly more excitement when it comes to Brexit, but Brexit fatigue still very much in the air, seemingly. We've been here before, as I'd put to both of our guests. Theresa May also had reached a deal, as we well know, with the EU. That has been rejected a number of times. Will the Johnson deal do any better? As we well know, the DUP says for now it will not sign on. Jeremy Corbyn of the Labour Party has already said this deal should be rejected. So as much as Johnson may be patting himself on the back at this moment, this may very well be very short-lived celebrations. He still very much needs to get this through the UK Parliament, which seems to have been a very tough task for May. Johnson doesn't seem to be the kind of person that can unite MPs, certainly even within just his own party, let alone the opposition parties as well as also the coalition partners. There's a lot, of course, on the line here when it comes to the border between Ireland and Northern Ireland, that being a very sensitive issue. And of course, there are other issues of trade deals, etc. also, but that main issue still very much remains. And it doesn't actually seem like anybody in Parliament has any bright ideas about how to really resolve that. So we'll keep a close eye on that here in Scope. I'll be back, though, with my next segment after this break. Stay tuned. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss Operation Peace Spring, which Turkey launched a number of days ago. It's now, I believe, day 8 or day 9 of that operation. Turkey says it is there to set up a safe zone in Syria itself, beyond the border, of course, and that it seeks to protect its own border from who it perceives as Kurdish terrorists or just terrorists, depending on who you ask. Now, of course, the U.S. president, a letter that he had sent on October 9th to Erdogan, President Erdogan of Turkey, that is, has been released by, I believe it is a Fox News reporter. And that letter is certainly very aggressive, warning the Turkish president not to be a fool, that he would be seen as a devil, that history would not judge him well, etc. Quite undiplomatic language being used in that letter. And of course, then there is the Russian criticism, the Iranian criticism of these operations, as well as, of course, the Syrian criticism itself about its own sovereignty being taken away from it. As we know, the Syrian army as well as the Kurdish have now then reached a deal. The Syrian army is being deployed now to those areas, to Manbij. It has already taken Manbij, for example. Will Turkey respect Syrian sovereignty? There's a lot, of course, on the line. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're joined now by Valeria Giannotta, who is an academician, an expert of international relations at Turk Havara Kurum University. She's joining us now from Ankara. We're joined from Istanbul now as well by Mr. Onur Erim, who is president of Dragoman Strategies. He's a political advisor, author, and previously has worked in the White House during the Clinton administration. Onur and Valeria, thank you both for your time today. Valeria, I'd like to start with you. Let's firstly talk about that letter of Donald Trump, because that seems to be the hottest topic of the day, at least. What did you make of the tone that Donald Trump took towards President Erdogan? Was it called for?
Well, yes, this is the news of the day. I mean, what is interesting that the date of the letter is 9 of October, just a few hours before the launch of the operation. The tone of the letter is a bit tough. I mean, it's a bit arrogant towards Turkey. We know that beforehand, the two presidents, Mr. Trump and Mr. Erdogan, they had a phone call, or maybe just right after the letter, the phone call happened. And as it is evident, the immediate reaction by the Turkish government was to neglect the letter and to start the military operation over Syria. So what comes to my eye is that the letter got published just right today, few hours before the arrival to Ankara to the Deputy President Pence and Mike Pompeo, that they are here in these hours to discuss the ceasefire. Of course, there is a sort of problem of communication between the two partners, from Ankara towards Washington and from Washington towards Ankara.
Indeed.
And Ankara is continuously saying we are not keen to put any ceasefire. It's our national interest is on the table, and we are going to protect our national interest. When they refer to the national interest, the protection of the border, so avoid what is so-called the creation of a terror corridor across the border. Terror corridor made by the Kurdish militia of YPG. They are considered as the Syrian sister of the PKK, that since more than 30 years is active in Turkey, and it's considered a terrorist organization not just from Ankara but from US and from European countries as well.
Indeed. Okay, so if you allow me, Valeria, I just want to put some of those points you made there to Onur as well. Onur, what do you make of this sort of communication, both ways, if we can call it that, but this way, of course, we're just talking about the American communication towards Turkey, because as we know, these sorts of things remain private usually. This was quite harsh, the language in this letter, and I imagine this will make for a very uncomfortable meeting, if that even does occur, between Pence, Pompeo, and Erdogan, or whoever on the Turkish side.
It's childish, it's uncalled for, it's undiplomatic. As a matter of fact, when I first saw the copy last night, I literally searched the internet for about 15 minutes because I thought it was a hoax, to be honest with you. Because I didn't think even Trump would be, I guess, crazy or childish enough to furnish such a letter, let alone sending it to a president like Erdogan. Anyway, it was sent on the 9th. I think there was a swift and immediate response from Erdogan by actually kickstarting the operation within a few hours of receiving that letter. So that was answered in the manner that it should have been. As far as the communication is concerned between Turkey, Ankara, and Washington, it had its problems and still having its problems for some time. Now, some attribute this to the damage that the FETA terrorist organization, has been placing on the relationship between Turkey and the U.S. But the Turco-American relations are far deeper than, I believe, for even a terrorist organization like FETA to put any kind of a halt on. But there has been a problem. The problem still continues. I could go on and on why this is so, but there's definitely not only a problem in communication, but in lines of communication as well. Okay, so Onur, let me just put one line of the letter to you for a moment and get your reaction to it. Do you think it's legitimate for the U.S. president to be, to be worried about the possible slaughter, or, as he says, you don't want to be responsible for slaughtering thousands of people, and I don't want to be responsible for destroying the Turkish economy. On the point of slaughtering thousands of people, is that a legitimate concern? I mean, obviously the international community too, as you well know, Onur, would express such a concern as well in such a case. To make a point like that, you would have to furnish a history of slaughters or a slaughter by the Turkish army in the history, which has never been done to my knowledge, at least in the last 100 years or more. On the other hand, destroying the Turkish economy, just because financially Turkey was even in a worse situation about a year and a half ago, when the case that he's talking about with Pastor Bronson happened. It only happened once, for only a brief period. They have openly trying to destroy, quote unquote, using Trump's words, destroying Turkish economy, and since then, and they have never been able to do so. 5 years ago, 10 years ago, such a letter in Turkish economy would have impacted to the Turkish lira to devalue overnight by 100-200%. Today, it actually decreased since he actually started talking about this. Okay, so on that point then, Valeria, I wanted to get your thoughts, because it was, in fact, as Onur there said, that when this threat had originally come out from Trump about destroying the Turkish economy, this had obviously come out in advance of this letter coming out. The economy didn't actually suffer, I mean, even with those sanctions now in place on Turkey. Why is that, do you think?
Well, actually, in the past, not later than 1 year ago, the Turkish economy has suffered a lot from this kind of threat by Donald Trump. We remind what happened in the summer of 2018 when it was enough that Donald Trump tweeted something against Turkish economy related to the Fethullah Gulen case and related to the ransom priest that got jailed in Turkey, that the Turkish economy totally collapsed. It's sort of the Turkish economy developed its own instrument, but this kind of threats do not find any fertile soil anymore. I mean, already Turkish economy got sanctioned by US. We remember that US got some tariffs on the trade of steel and iron as well, so they cannot go that further any longer. I mean, there is no credibility. It's even a matter of credibility for Donald Trump to do such a thing towards Turkey. In the global environment, anyway, US is still the first trade partner of US, and the interchange is very high. So US at the end, in the long term, is going to harm its own interest as well. I think that anything anyway is related to a matter of credibility. I mean, if Donald Trump wants really to target Turkish economy, has to apply some different instruments, not just tweeting or threatening the Turkish economy as he did before.
All right, so Valeria, on the point then, put to Onur as well, and I don't want to just concentrate on Trump for the whole discussion. I mean, there have been concerns expressed by Russia as well as Iran and others around the world, as well as, of course, the United States, about how innocent civilians may suffer because of these operations being carried out by Turkey. Is that a valid point to be concerned about?
The Turkish economy is constantly pointing out that the main target of the operation, and it was in 2018 along the Olive Branch operation and much more before in 2016 along the Euphrates Shields operation, is just the terrorist organizations. So there is a sort of mainstream media and a mainstream concern towards Turkey this time. I do believe anyway that as I live in Turkey and as I know Turkish people, I'm not that expert of Turkish army, but about Turkish culture, yes, there is always a respect towards the other and overall towards churches, towards mosques and towards civilian as well. There is clearly a smear campaign against Turkey led by some interest. Of course, we are in a warfare, so in any kind of war context, the victims can be high, but I think Turkey is taking all precautions that it can have in order to avoid such a slaughtering.
Okay. All right. So Onur, I wanted to push that point. It's not just then about civilians on the other side of the border. It's also then about Syrian sovereignty. And I know you know well that that's the concern expressed by Russia and Iran as well as others, I believe. Do you think that that is a legitimate concern? I know that, of course, we know that there has been a situation in Syria for a number of years now where there have been a lot of external players involved, but certainly respecting another sovereign country's sovereignty, pardon me for putting it that way, that's important, isn't it? So does Turkey respect Syrian sovereignty?
Sure, it's important, but we have to first underline why Turkey or how Turkey is in there. The UN Charter gives us that right. The UN Security Council, I believe 2 decisions give us that right. And most of all, what's known as the Adana Treaty of 1998 between Turkey and Syria certainly gives us that right. I don't think that when Turkey has never in its history shown any signs of intervening with a sovereignty of a neighbor or a nation, when that is not so, why Turkey is blamed this way, especially by Russia, who has no business whatsoever in Syria, but they are, yet their intervention is not being questioned, or USA, who again has no business in Syria, but they're there and their intervention into Syria's sovereignty is not being questioned.
But then, Onur, on that point, I'm glad you brought that up, but you know what the defense would be, right? Russia would say, listen, we were invited in by Assad, and the U.S., mind you, is criticized by all of the above for also being involved there, though it was not invited in.
Well, again, but I said that treaty, the Adana Treaty, 1998, is still a standing treaty. It was signed by Assad's father. It's still in effect, and it gives us forget about the UN Charter, forget about the Security Council resolutions, but that treaty alone gives us the right. First of all, Assad, the regime, is been accepting over and over that there is a there is a group of people, whether we call them terrorists, for whatever reason, the U.S. calls them, Trump calls them Kurds. I don't know where he comes off doing that. But whomever they call, it's an armed group of people that has nothing to do with the regime. Yet they're there. They are threatening Turkey's security. So everybody's taken from one side to another. What Turkish perspective is very clear. We have a serious, heavily armed by the U.S. a terrorist group that's threatening Turkey's sovereignty, Turkish borders, security, and the people of Turkey's security. That's what we're there to do so. And we're going to pull out as soon as it's done. President Erdogan said yesterday, you want this operation to be over? Fine. Have all the YPG instruments leave the area, leaving their arms and getting out of the area. The operation will be over in that second. And that's it. There's nothing else to say about that.
Okay, let's continue the conversation, Valeria. Now that we know that the Kurds in Syria, as well as the Syrian army, i.e. this army of Bashar al-Assad specifically, have reached a deal of some sort, do you think that might actually help in this situation, in the sense that it would tell Turkey, listen, the Syrian army itself now will be at its borders? So I imagine that would give it some relief and comfort that it will not then be attacked by terrorists?
Yes, the general atmosphere in Turkey is like that. I refer to two different statements by President Mr. Erdogan, who says that the situation in Manbij, as long as there is Assad troop, it does not represent a problem for us. The real problem are the Kurdish militias, and the same as Kobane. 2 days ago, he clearly stated Kobane, his team is not going to be a problem for us. So the main point for Turkey, as my colleague before said, is just to avoid the establishment of a Kurdish autonomy across the border. So once Assad goes there and somehow puts away the YPG through some other deals, I think this is going to be a better option for Turkey. In the long term, along this new operation across the border, Turkey had even the second goal after cleaning the zone from the terrorists was the establishment of a safe zone. And in this case, if Assad goes and cleans, replace the YPG militias in the border, maybe the Aden agreement that it was stopped just right after the eruption of the conflict in 2011 can be replaced as well. This Aden agreement was a long-standing agreement between Ankara and Damascus, and it forecast that any PKK activity in Syria would be persecuted. And as outcome of this agreement, Abdullah Öcalan at that time was sent back to Turkey, and nowadays is still jailed. So this can be the most positive scenario for Turkey, actually.
Okay. So, Onur, what are your thoughts on that? Is it a good that the Syrian government and the Kurds have come to some sort of a deal in the sense that the Syrian army itself would then be really at Turkey's border?
I think it's just an agreement where both sides are satisfying what they need to do momentarily, but it could never be a long-standing relationship, because Assad in the past, and actually till very recently, was also in agreement that YPG, PKK, is a terrorist group. So they are just doing this for the time being. And let's not forget, I'm really, I don't mean my colleague, but I'm really bothered with the U.S.'s actually Trump's imposition to the world that he's dealing with Kurds. He's not dealing with Kurds. He's dealing with a terrorist organization, which used to call itself PKK, then switched to YPG, then switched to SDF. Again, this is not my assessment. This is actually the official view of the U.S. government. And let's not forget, because people not knowing the area too well, Syria's population is only maximum 7 to 8% Kurdish. And of those, only about 15 to 16% of it is represented by the so-called YPG or SDF. So we are talking about a pseudo, organization, a pseudo presence, Kurdish presence, quote unquote, in North Syria, which there is not. So we are happy that the Syrian army, the regime's army, is coming to protect its own borders. We have no problem with that now. President Erdogan reiterated this yesterday, and let's not forget, President Erdogan doesn't have the best of relationship or best of thoughts about Assad. Yeah. But still, it's their own country. They should defend it. Our only opposition would come in where anybody, including the regime, would start harvesting the PKK, YPG, or SDF terrorists within their borders. That's it. Right. Other than that, we have no business there.
Very well. So, Valeria, let's now then talk about the Pence-Pompeo visit, because as we know, the U.S. President Donald Trump has called for an immediate ceasefire to be put in place. President Erdogan has obviously strongly responded to that, saying that there would not be a ceasefire until Turkey was able to secure its borders, according to him. What do you think that meeting will then achieve? Will it achieve what Turkey wants?
I think the U.S. will keep its own position, and it happened before. We should remember that before the launch of the operation, already an American delegation came to Ankara in order to dissuade Erdogan to launch the operation. So a lot of talks have been going on over the time. So I think that the two perception, the two positions will not change that much. But what is interesting to see that next week, anyway, there will be a new meeting between Russia, Turkey, and the representative of the Assad regime in Sochi. And I think this is a clear sign that a sort of agreement, even if it's not that clear from Ankara, between Ankara and Assad, is already on the table. Going back to the topic we were discussing before, having Assad troops in the border is a better option rather than having the YPG militias in the border.
Onur, what are your thoughts on what this meeting will achieve? Anything? Because I'm imagining that neither side is really going to be willing to back down, especially considering all these statements that have now come out into the open.
You are probably absolutely right, but also let's not forget it was a weird day yesterday because Vice President Pence, a couple of hours before Trump's news conference, came out and said we're going there to mediate between Turkey and YPG, which, if anybody anybody having a slight idea about Turkey's policy, which will never happen. But what was more weird was that then Trump came out in his own press conference alongside the Italian president, and he talked about how the U.S. forces have defeated ISIS Caliphate 100%, and their job there was finished, and how the fight between Syria and Turkey and the Kurds on the region has been going on for hundreds of years, and that the U.S. has nothing to do with it, and they don't want anything to do with it. So why would you want to send an envoy of this magnitude to mediate something that you really are saying you don't care about anymore? Let them fight themselves. So it was kind of weird. I think all these, including yesterday's meeting with the pre-envoy, today's meeting with Vice President Pence and Secretary Pompeo, the Sochi meeting, the meeting in Geneva at the end of the month about the Syrian constitution, are all going to be leading the path to see what actually will end up happening in northern Syria, which I think we'll see the codes of on the the November 13th meeting on the invitation of President Trump to Erdogan in Washington, D.C. I think these are all things that are leading the path to that day where people are actually going to start finding out what the exact agenda in North Syria is.
Okay, so Valeria, one of the major issues that's been spoken about here is also the fact that obviously Turkey is a very vital member of NATO as well. And early on, we had the Europeans, when they criticized Turkey for this operation, President Erdogan had quite clearly said that, listen, we can send over all those Syrian refugees who we are currently hosting, very large numbers of them, of course, over to you, if you would so like, if you would need to obviously think about your criticism in that context as well. What do you think that relationship will be like going forward? Has that been damaged?
Between Turkey and European Union, we are witnessing the lowest point of relationship ever. I mean, we are talking out of the accession process, the negotiation process that is basically frozen by Brussels. I mean, they are continuously repeating that they do not trust Turkey, they don't want to talk with this kind of Turkey. And this has created a sort of frustration from both sides. Again, a problem of communication. Of course, when it comes to the refugees, it was the European Union who put Turkey in this powerful position in dealing with the refugees. I mean, remember in the meeting between Angela Merkel, the German chancellor, and Mr. President Erdogan in 2016, and an agreement got signed. The condition of this agreement weren't fulfilled completely by Brussels and the European bloc. We remember that the agreement forecast sort of 9 million euro in 3 years in order to build facilities in welcoming the refugees. Out of these 9 billion euro, just 6 billion have been delivered to Turkey. So there is a huge gap. Economically speaking. Another condition of the agreements was the visa liberalization for the Turkish citizens heading the European Union, the Schengen area. This condition was made discretional to the fact that in Turkey there is a terror law that is considered against the liberal values of the European Union. So Brussels asked to Turkey to review the terrorism law, and actually they created a sort of commission. They're working on this. So the frustration that Ankara is experiencing is based on a real fact. I mean, there is the so-called pacta sunt servanda weren't fulfilled completely by the European Union. European Union, on the other side, doesn't have an effective policy in dealing with refugees. That's why it needs Turkey more than any other partner nowadays.
Okay, so we'll leave that as a getting word, but of course I know that we've just touched the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot to discuss, of course, when it comes to this Operation Peace Spring and its ramifications and the relations between Turkey and the rest of the world, especially the Western world, if we're talking about Europe, NATO, etc. But I'll appreciate both of our guests, Valeria and Onur, for taking their time out and, of course, sharing their thoughts with us and their expert insight. Viewers, Operation Peace Spring, of course, continues at this time. We've had now that very aggressive letter by Donald Trump, dated, of course, October 9th, but has just come out today. That's going viral, of course, for the language that Donald Trump uses, telling Erdogan not to be a fool and saying that history would brand him a devil, etc. if this situation in northeast Syria goes south, according to the U.S. standards or Western standards. There's a lot there, of course, to talk about the relationship right now then between Ankara and Washington, and Ankara really and the rest of Europe and NATO, etc. Because obviously we know the Europeans need, as Valeria there correctly said, Turkey to remain on their side when it comes especially to this refugee crisis issue as well. Turkey hosting a very large number of Syrian refugees. Onur, they're saying that Turkey doesn't mind, of course, the Syrian army getting involved and coming to the border area as well, but considering it is Syrian territory and that Turkey does respect Syrian sovereignty. That's something, of course, which I'm sure the rest of the world will hold Turkey to account for if there is anything lacking in that regard vis-a-vis Syrian sovereignty, which is seemingly at least the primary concern on the part of some people around the world, be it the Russians, Iranians, or others. I'll leave it there for now, though. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Stay tuned. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment of the program, we're going to discuss Julian Assange. And the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture has said Assange has been psychologically tortured and his due process rights have been systematically violated by all states involved. We can talk, of course, about the UK, the US, etc. He's currently imprisoned, as we know, on a 50-week sentence for bail evasion at a maximum security facility in the UK that is, in fact, used to house terrorists, murderers, and other high-profile offenders as well. He's reportedly spent much of his time there in prison hospital. Now, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture actually visited the prison itself and met Assange and then came to these conclusions. Let's discuss this all a bit further with our panelists. We're joined now by Jeremy Bioletti, who is a human rights barrister. He's joining us now from Auckland in New Zealand. We're also joined from London by Naomi Colvin, who is a UK program director at Blueprint for Free Speech. Naomi and Jeremy, thank you both for your time today. And Naomi, let me start with you. How concerning is the situation surrounding Julian Assange?
It's very concerning. Obviously, as you know, he's the subject of an unprecedented indictment from the United States for trying to prosecute him for publishing true information in the public interest. He's been under unrelenting pressure in various ways for the best part of 10 years. And as you said, he's currently detained in the prison hospital at Belmarsh, which is a high security prison in southeast London. He's actually finished serving his bail offence, so he's now being detained purely for the purposes of extradition. And he has an extradition, well, there's a preliminary hearing on Monday, but the full hearing will happen in spring next year. So he's going to spend the best part of a year in those conditions in Belmarsh, just awaiting this hearing.
All right, so, Jeremy, Nils Elzer, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, said that it defies logic, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, the statement that democratic states would be okay with the kind of treatment that Assange is receiving. What are your thoughts on that? Is that correct and legitimate concern?
Well, he knew from the outset that his situation in the UK was something to do with Sweden, but mainly to do with extradition to the USA, and that's shown to be the case. That they had an investigation way back, 2012, around that time. So he was on the money as to what they were after him for, and they're playing for keeps. There's no doubt about that. And if he gets to an extradition hearing in February of next year, that's just one level. He could be there for another year or 2 years after that before it's decided whether he'd be extradited or not. So that's another 3 years, so that's up to 10 years of detention. That's just not good. Not good for anybody.
And so what is the message, do you think, Naomi, that much of the democratic world really right now is sending to the rest of the world when it comes to free speech and freedom of expression, etc., and even the right to know really what's happening even behind the scenes when it comes to government dealings? I imagine the message is sort of like an Orwellian, Big Brother is always watching, and how dare you go against us?
Yes, well, it's if you dare to tell the public the truth about what happens in war, what happens in diplomacy, about the aspects of behaviour that we don't like, will come down on you like a ton of bricks. It's extremely worrying. All of these historic principles in favour of freedom of the press, and that people in democracies should understand what their governments are doing in order to hold their governments accountable. This is all under threat with Julian's prosecution. We have to remember that Julian has been charged with it's the publications of 2010. It's those world-changing disclosures that came from US military whistleblower Chelsea Manning. It's the State Department cables, it's the Iran-Iraq war logs, it's the Guantanamo files, it's the collateral murder video, all incredibly important stuff. And what the US is saying here is that WikiLeaks, who was working with the most famous journalistic organizations in the world at this point, The Guardian, The New York Times, Der Spiegel, saying that all of these publications are committing criminal activity by publishing things the US government does not like. It's part of President Trump's war on the free media, and it's incredibly dangerous. Trump is trying to impose his authoritarian attitudes that he's exhibiting all the time in the United States on the rest of the world. We should all be incredibly concerned about.
But it's not just Trump, is it, though, Naomi? I mean, this goes back to even Obama. It's really just the U.S. establishment as a whole, isn't it? That's at war with freedom of information in this way. So
I think there's been a step up under Trump. President Obama, as we know, prosecuted more whistleblowers than any president who came before him. Chelsea Manning was sentenced to 35 years in prison, which is extraordinary. Obama commuted her sentence, but now Chelsea's back in prison again for pretty much the same reason, actually. But there was a line for the Obama administration, and that was they were happy to prosecute whistleblowers, but they didn't want to prosecute WikiLeaks because they couldn't find a way of prosecuting WikiLeaks, which wouldn't mean that they wouldn't also prosecute the New York Times. Now, the problem is, you see, for the Trump administration, if you prosecute WikiLeaks, you're prosecuting the New York Times. That's a feature for them. That's not a bug. That's what they want to do. So that's what's going on here. It's incredibly serious. It's the Trump administration imposing its agenda on the rest of the world, and the UK needs to resist it, but all of us need to resist it.
Okay, so then, Jeremy, what are your thoughts on this war on just the right to know, the public's right to know what's happening?
Well, it's interesting because I think that the grand jury hearing in the US in relation to Assange, Manning is being penalised for not cooperating there. There's another guy, Hammond, who they want to have to go in there to give evidence. And the whole thing I find just totally spooky, the idea that people who have, gathered or published information about corporate America, corporates in America who spy on citizens for the government, all of these people are being gathered up in the net, and I think it's appalling. Just how I would describe it.
All right, so Naomi, one of the arguments that comes up against what Assange has done and what WikiLeaks does, even till today, is that they put U.S. national security and even other countries' national security at risk. I mean, there is a fine line there, isn't there, Naomi, when you are then releasing all sorts of information, which may very well be putting soldiers or others' lives at risk?
So there's a few things wrapped up in that question. I work in whistleblowing policy, and really sort of the established line is that you can't classify evidence of a war crime as national security and stop it being released on that basis. There is an inherent public right to know about crimes against humanity that their governments are committing. That outweighs any claim of national security. Governments have valid interest in keeping some information confidential for a limited time, but there is no valid reason for keeping evidence of war crimes, other crimes against humanity, secret, or sort of parceling off as national security so we can't know about them. That's a misuse of national security rules.
What are your thoughts on that, Jeremy? Because again, that art, as you well know, Jeremy, is one that comes up a lot.
And it's an accusation that is easily made against citizens, that somehow their actions are affecting national security. But of course, when these citizens go to the government to try to find out what they're accused of, the government says, "Oh, national security, we're not going to tell you." So, how do you and I or anybody actually know whether they're telling the truth? I don't, because you can't find out. And this is part of the problem. The whole situation is now geared towards corporate people, government people, and the average citizen floating around in the middle is of no consequence whatsoever. Their rights, no consequence at all.
Very well. We'll leave there as a final word, but of course we appreciate both Jeremy and Naomi for their time today, and of course for putting this all into context for us. Viewers, this case of Julian Assange is certainly worrying, and a number of countries around the world have of course expressed their concern, but this time of course the United Nations, a rapporteur on torture, has expressed concern very specifically after having met Assange at Belmarsh prison, where Assange is currently in the prison hospital and is currently still waiting a trial about extradition to the United States, where he's wanted, of course, for releasing classified information and for, again, jeopardizing national security, et cetera, et cetera. The list really goes on. And, of course, the charges and what may possibly be ending up as when he does, if he is convicted, the time that he would serve are, of course, just unimaginable amount of time that one would serve simply for giving people the right to know, for releasing information that everybody around the world should really know of. As Naomi there said, everyone has the right to know of the war crimes that their country is committing. elsewhere, be it in Iraq or in other places around the world where they may be militarily involved or otherwise. We'll keep a close eye, of course, on that Assange case here in Scope. I'll leave it there for now, though. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.